Animation is a medium that has no theoretical bounds. Any story in any setting with any characters can be told. If you want to do a retelling of Hamlet, except every character is an animal, with lions being the primary focus, that's possible. Or maybe you want to retell Robin Hood, except everyone's an animal. Or maybe you want to do a buddy cop film, except one of the characters is a criminal, and they're also animals. Wait, I'm missing a trend here. The point is, theoretically, you can be incredibly creative with the types of stories you want to tell, and we're seeing that in animation constantly. But that creativity is not just expressed in the story, but also the presentation. In filmmaking, style can be prevalent. Some of the most famous directors of all time are known for their clear stylistic decisions. And animation isn't a tool that limits stylistic creativity, it does the opposite. Yet despite all of this, I feel like animation recently has moved to be more and more homogenous, prioritizing one specific goal: realistic beauty. I'm not here to criticize that pursuit, just highlight the fact that on a spectrum, as one side is pursued more and more, it creates a vacuum and demand on the other. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about the return of stylistic anime. There are very few mediums that I think have so successfully pulled off stylistic storytelling as anime. So many shows that I love were created with a very unique style that would almost be instantly recognizable. For this video, I decided to write some shows down that felt hyper stylistic, and the list was really easy to fill out. For example, to list a few just from shows and movies I've seen: Gurren Lagann, Paprika, anything from Hayao Miyazaki, Ping Pong the Animation, Mob Psycho, Cyberpunk Edgerunners. These are just some examples. I'm sure you can think of lots yourself. And that doesn't even include shows that I haven't seen, like Mononoke, Trigun, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, or that new One Piece fan letter. Style is prevalent in this genre, but that doesn't feel like it's been so true lately. So the point of this video is to explore that idea of, is style actually becoming less prominent? While also talking about this new show that's airing that I think is full of style. One so good it made me realize just how much I missed hyper stylistic anime. But before we get to that, there's a couple things we have to talk about first. Anime as a genre has certain stylistic norms. An example might be this argument that anime characters are based off of the shaped face of cats, emulating their cuteness. Now, this isn't a proven case, just a compelling argument made by a man named Hantani Sadahiko. The point being that anime has a distinct style, one based in exaggerated features, like the eyes, which are more expressive. Another really interesting example is, you know that trend where people get nosebleeds whenever they're put in fan service situations? There's no real reason for it outside of the fact that it was introduced in a manga in the 1970s. Animation in its purest nature is inherently stylistic. However, there are certain shows that take that stylism to the next level, and it's been done really well multiple times. But has stylistic animation become less common? I feel like with modern animation both in the West and in anime, there's been this trend towards hyper-realistic beauty, and extreme attention to detail, focusing on things like texture, lighting and shadows, movement and sound design. Anime is adding more midtones, steps between light and shadow. Reflective material is catching light more often, even to the point of exaggeration, because it results in this really beautiful product. It feels like every mainstream release, even if it's not a very good show, is still beautiful. Animation standards are outstanding. However, while this trend is engaging and interesting, it's also led to a more homogeneous environment. A lot of beautiful shows are starting to feel like one another. While I believe it to be a thing in anime, I think it's even more exaggerated with a production studio like Pixar. A film that represents this to me a lot is Inside Out. I remember seeing it in 2015 in theaters and being blown away by the quality of animation. It was really beautiful, and more than anything, it was doing things with CGI that I didn't think were possible. The two most obvious being the way they played with light and texture. Pixar's first film was Toy Story, and the reason they chose to tell that story in particular was because it lended itself to their capabilities with computer graphics. Everything they rendered looked like plastic, so they chose to tell a story about toys that were made of plastic. Whereas if we look at Inside Out, Joy's character design is actually the opposite. Look at the textures they use. Her hair looks feathery, her skin is almost fuzzy, her eyes are exaggerated and beautiful. An incredibly ambitious choice in design, because historically these things have been really hard to do in CG. It feels like the main priority Pixar has carried for a long time is pushing the limits when it comes to computer graphics. Another really cool example of this is the way they used lighting in this scene that I didn't even remember. The light from the hall is the primary light source. Watch how the shadows are cast on the main character as her father gets up and closes the door. The reason it's so realistic is because of the engine they're using. And this movie is chock full of these types of things in a way that's not normally done in animation. This is also happening in anime. One of my favorite movies of all time is Your Name, and it's a great example of remarkable attention to detail This specific way of making animation I'm going to call ultra realism, emulating things from real life in a more exaggerated way to make a beautiful image, like putting dust particles that reflect some of the light breaking through a window, or making any object that might shimmer or shine more exaggerated. I find this type of animation beautiful, but also it's becoming more common. Now, in juxtaposition to this ultra realism is one of my all-time favorite animated films, Into the Spider-Verse. It's highly stylistic, emulating comic books with hatching shadows, onomatopoeia, and an animated frame rate that's meant to be a little clunkier. This movie is not only beautiful, it's also different, stylized in a way that's not only unique but makes the story better. Historically, anime is chock full of so many different examples of highly stylized animation, but lately, to me, it feels like there's been an arms race towards hyperrealism, resulting in many shows feeling a lot alike. There's also a really interesting conversation to be had about the parallels between this discussion and one about video game graphics. The thing about video games that's really interesting is, unlike animation, sometimes they're actually trying to be as realistic as possible. This is especially common with modern AAA games. And actually, a good friend of mine and fellow YouTuber Bizly talked about this in one of his videos a while back. A quote he used that I actually think I introduced to him is that limitations breed creativity. Stylistic art direction that takes less resources can be as, if not more beautiful than ultra-realistic graphics. Ultimately, the crux of my argument that I think also applies to his is that realism is not worse than stylistic art direction, but it's nice to have a balance. And sometimes when products are really good at being stylistic, it can make for such a unique viewing experience. That video of Bizly's is one of my all-time favorites, and I really suggest you go check it out. There'll be a link in the description. But now it's time for us to focus on the whole reason this video was made, a new airing anime that's overflowing with style. A show that made me realize just how much I missed weird but beautiful art direction. One with arguably the best OP I've ever heard. Dandadan is first very weird and second very good. It falls into that categorization that I'd also probably put Gurren Lagann, where if it weren't so good, it'd probably be terrible. And a quick disclaimer, it immediately jumps into some pretty crazy shit in episode 1, so if you have any sensitivities, I would suggest you check out the warnings. I do, however, think it ends up in a pretty interesting spot by the end of episode 4, so take that as you will. Now, disclaimers out of the way, the show is really good. It's unique but reminiscent of things I love without being too close to any of them. It has a very clear identity it engages in. It's a weird show with an even weirder premise. It's a lot, but that's also kind of what makes it so special because it does it so well. That's actually a great way to describe the show in 2 words, a lot. But the quality is there. A good example of that is its opening, arguably the best I've ever seen. And oh my god, its style is so good. And I think that's apparent right away. Take literally the first scene, for example. There's simple shading, crude lines, and single color tones. His metal earring doesn't glimmer at all. It's really simplistic, and then it's matched with this kick. It immediately sets an awesome tone for the rest of the show, and so far that's held up. It's such a breath of fresh air compared to so many of the other seasonal releases we've gotten recently, which by the way are very good. The characters in this show are a weird mix of really likable and really annoying, but in a way that's actually very fun to watch. They embrace some tropes, then add layers on top that are really interesting. For example, the male lead in some ways is this stereotypical self-loathing loner, who then leans at times too much on this confident, eccentric female lead. This foundation is so cliche, the only thing they could do to make it more so is give him some superpower that makes him actually super sick. Oh, they do that too? But what makes it so good is that superpower actually turns him into this hyper-depressed caricature, adding a really needed sense of comedic relief from him being so cool. Also, coming back to him being a loner, there's these moments where he opens up to the female lead. These heartfelt little scenes where he's feeling super insecure, and when she kind of validates that insecurity and shares that she actually kind of likes him, he immediately reverts into this argumentative otaku personality. He's kind of this perfect little mix of flawed but not too flawed. The dynamic between the two is really fun, which is important because it's a major component of the show. But that solid foundation is expressed in incredibly interesting ways. Characters are super expressive, the action animation is beautiful and dramatic, and the story matches this overwhelmingly unique tone. I'm really excited to see where this show goes because it feels like such a breath of fresh air, one that I kind of didn't even realize I needed. Ultra stylistic storytelling and animation will always have a place in the anime industry. It's just too fun and engaging. And as much as that's been proven over and over, it felt like Dandadan came back another time and proved it again.